Ever since I uploaded some screen grabs of my interview setup for my recent short documentary Cutting Edge, people really wanted to know how I shot it. And of course I promised to do a full breakdown of how we shot it, the audio, the lighting, the camera settings, the location, everything. And well, today is this day. Only about a year later. So let's not waste any more time. My name is Damien Cooper and welcome to how to shoot a cinematic interview. Let's start with one of the most important things about this interview, and that was the location. Without the location, I don't think that the production value would have looked as high as it did in the end. Usually when filming a documentary piece, I want the location to reflect a little bit about the story. So first we went for a locker room in an ice rink. Unfortunately, we really didn't like the location and it wasn't as high of a production quality as we were hoping it to be, so we switched our plans around. And here I found this gorgeous location, and this is usually about 1,200 euros a day, but we got it for cheap for around 600 euros a day because it was off season, it was still Corona I believe, so we were really lucky with that one. 600 euros a day was quite reasonable, and I would have paid this just to shoot this interview at this location, but we also used the location to shoot parts of my upcoming online course about how to shoot interviews, because I'm doing a full masterclass on how to shoot interviews in the future. So here's my first tip: if you can make it work and your location reflects your story, great, but I would always take a really nice looking location over a not so nice looking location, even though it has nothing to do with the story whatsoever. When choosing our composition and where to place her in the location, I was looking for leading lines, for interesting patterns, and just an overall nice look. I really wanted to have this big window in the shot because not only did it give us some leading lines to frame her properly, but it was also a great motivated light source, but I will be talking about the lighting in detail later. With moving some furniture around, we also created a bit of a pattern from light to dark to light to dark, and that worked out really well to get a little bit more volume into our shot. To create even more depth in our interview, we also used a haze machine, and although this looked really good on camera afterwards, it was also a bit of a hassle because the entire interview took around 1.5 hours and we had to rehaze constantly. And using haze or smoke machines on an interview is always kinda because you don't want to interrupt your storytelling, especially when it gets emotional, because you need to rehaze or you have too much haze in your shot, and that sometimes even presented us with some problems. But overall, I think it was worth it, but you really have to be careful when using haze on emotional interviews. The last thing we needed to match to our location was her clothing, because I wanted to go for a simple brown earth tone color palette. Her white turtleneck alongside with just a simple pair of blue jeans actually worked quite well with the location. If she would have worn some bright colors that popped out like an orange or red, the whole scene would have not worked as well as it did. So that's it for the location, let's move on to the camera department. We shot this entire interview with 3 different angles, and I'm a big fan of wide angle shots, especially for interviews where you actually see the entire location. The wide shot was shot on a Canon C70 with a speed booster, and I used a 50mm Sigma 1.4 for this. Moving the camera back a little gave us enough context and wide angle for the location, but it also gave us a really nice compressed background. Since the Sigma lenses are tech sharp, I wanted to diffuse them a little bit more, so we used a 1/4 black mist filter on top of the 50mm. My camera settings for the wide shot were 6 stops of ND, I shot everything wide open at an aperture of 1.0, it's a 1.4 lens, but with the speed booster you can make it even faster, and I used an ISO of 1250. My frame rate were 25 frames with a shutter of 180 degrees, and I also shot everything in MP4. My second angle was a mid-shot to close-up, and I also used the Canon C70 here, also with the speed booster, but this time I used a Canon 100mm 2.8 macro lens. This lens gave me a really nice compressed background and also the framing that I was looking for. As with the 50mm lens, I also used a mist filter here to soften up her skin tones a little bit. The final angle here was a Canon C300 Mark III with a Sigma 85mm, also with a mist filter. And we had this angle operated by Franco on a tripod on a fluid head because I wanted to switch between a close-up of her face but also close-up details of her hands when she's moving, so he was switching back and forth between the two. The 2 Canon C70s stood on 2 cheap tripods that I found on Amazon, and for what they needed to do, that actually worked out quite fine, and I will link them down in the description below too. The Canon C300 Mark III being a bit heavier and also had to move in those shots, I put them on my Sachtler Flowtech 75 with a fluid head. Overall, I found my choice of using the Canon C70s for this interview setup being the right choice, because I really like the sensor with its dynamic range, which was really favorable for this location, especially having this big window in the background, and the image is not looking too digital and it's a bit soft, which is exactly what I was going for. And now let's talk a bit more about the audio. When shooting important interviews, I always use two sources of audio, one lavalier microphone and one shotgun microphone. I hid one lavalier microphone under her clothing, and for this I used a Tentacle Track E with a Bumblebee attachment, which was attached directly to her bra. My second source of audio, and that was the one that I eventually ended up using in the edit, was an XLR shotgun microphone wired into a Zoom F6 recorder. For this I used a Synco D1, and that was not my microphone of choice. I wanted to use my Deity S Mic 2S, but I rented it out 3 weeks prior and they kept re-renting it, and I didn't have it on the day of the shoot, although I was supposed to get it back, but then they actually extended their rental, so I had to use my Synco D1. And in the end, I actually think that the audio sounded perfectly fine. Both the Tentacle Track E as well as the Zoom F6 both use 32-bit float. And I love this ever since I discovered it, and I use this for all of my interview setups. And if you want to know more about this, I have an old review about the Tentacle Track E's that I will link up here. To keep all of our cameras as well as the audio in sync, we used a Tentacle Sync timecode setup. Just so that you can see the difference between the two microphones, I will show a 2 clip of both of these microphones and you can decide which one you like better.
I skated for 2 years with a broken heel until I couldn't walk anymore. And I went to a lot of doctors and everybody said it's just in my head and I do too much training. And I skated for 2 years with a broken heel until I couldn't walk anymore. And I went to a lot of doctors and everybody said it's just in my head and I do too much training. And
to actually make the audio sound as good as it did, I had to do some editing in post. The room was really echoey, so I used an AI tool that I use all the time to get rid of that echo. So here's a before and after.
I skated for 2 years with a broken heel until I couldn't walk anymore. I skated for 2 years with a broken heel until I couldn't walk anymore.
The rest I had to do was just adjust the levels and also edit the voice over just a tiny bit. I placed the microphone as close to her mouth as I can without it being in the shot. And I did this with a C-stand and a boom pole. That's it for the audio part. Now let's talk about the most complex part of the interview, and that is the lighting. First of all, we started with the available light in the room, and this was obviously the big window source, and we also had some practicals. And this is how I started setting up for all of my interview setups. Let's see what we actually have and how we can work with it. So without having any of our own lights, I just turned up the lights that we had in the room. Some of the spotlights that were just above her we had to turn off because otherwise it would have just interfered with her, but some of them I actually left on because they made for some great color contrast in the background and also filled up that negative space. We then found another practical light that we moved in the background because it gave the whole scene a bit more of this dark, bright pattern, and it also created more color contrast. Those were just regular tungsten lights, so we exposed for the window as well as those tungsten lights without even moving in our own lights at all. Once I was satisfied with the available light, I started to light the scene myself. The first light I brought in was a hair light, and the intention here was to separate her more from the background as well as mimic the practical that was standing behind her. For this I used an LED flex light with a softbox as well as a honeycomb grid. I placed this light way above her around a 45-degree angle with a C-stand and a boom pole. To not have too much fill on the dark side of her face and especially not have any spill towards her nose and the front side of her face, I also used a flag to just control my light a little bit better. The light that I used on that shoot is probably not the light that I would choose for future shoots, but it worked well for that one in particular. But for future shoots I would probably use a light tube for this because it's easier to control and easier to rig up. So now let's talk about our key light. I wanted to have a really big and soft light source so that it looks like it's coming from the window and she's really naturally being lit. In order to achieve this, I used a Godox FL300, and this is a 300 watt COB light. I had the light on full power the entire time and it was just enough to light her correctly, with us being on 6 stops of ND to expose for the big window in the background. So it would have been probably on the safer side to use a 600 watt light, but the 300 watt light was the strongest light that I had at the time. To achieve this really soft wrapped around light, I used a parabolic softbox with only the small layer of diffusion. I then used an Intelitech Diffusion fast frame to put in between my light source and my subject. And this is a 5 feet by 6.5 feet diffusion frame. And this was the perfect size to give us this really nice and soft key light. It being a rectangular shape instead of being a round softbox, it also helped selling the idea of our light coming from the window on the side, because it also gave us this gorgeous catch light in her eyes. I had the key light placed on a 45-degree angle on our camera right, and this way we still have some shadows and we achieved a bit of a Rembrandt lighting. We then used all of our cameras to shoot into the dark side of her face to create a bit of a silhouette and therefore create more depth. And that's all the light that we needed. I was fully prepared to set up 4 or 5 lights with more flex to create more contrast, but in the end I was really happy with the results that I got out of these 2 lights plus the available light in the room. I think our contrast ratios from dark to bright were perfect for this shoot and the story that we wanted to tell. Funnily enough, since then we shot a ton of different projects, especially interview setups, and I didn't use any of the lighting setup that I used for this particular shoot. So if you're interested in more breakdowns of interviews, then make sure to subscribe, because I will do so, and then I will explain also what other kind of lighting equipment I used for all of the other shoots. The last thing I had to do to achieve this cinematic look for our interview setup was color grading. And that was surprisingly easy, because all I had to do was throw in one of my custom LUTs, do a bit of a color correction, and that's pretty much it. And if you're interested in those LUTs, then check out the link down in the description below. But if you want to see an in-depth video on how I color graded the entire short film documentary, make sure to subscribe, because this video will be up next week on my channel. And if you have any more questions about the documentary, and this could be how we shot it, the story, how much we had to pay for everything, you name it, then leave a comment down in the description below, because also at the end of next week I will do a full behind the scenes and making of for this documentary shoot, and I will answer all of your questions here. And if you enjoyed this video, then please give it a thumbs up, because it really helps the channel grow. Subscribe for more content, and I hope to see you on the next one.